Hello, this is Orthotomeo, and we are rightly dividing the word of truth. And I am Dr. S.W. Kibler, your guide into the biblical text where truth lives. Thank you for joining me today. It's going to be a very interesting study as we continue on with the first chapter of the book of Genesis and the biblical account of creation. So we're going to be reading in Genesis chapter 1, beginning with verse 9 through 13. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants, yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was an evening, and there was morning, the third day. Well, last video, we looked at the biblical text regarding the expanse and the division of the waters, right? The waters above the expanse and the waters below, that is on the earth. And the earth is still formless and uninhabited, is formless and void. It's just sitting there in the expanse and covered with water. You know, here, in this portion of the biblical text, the Creator God begins to bring form to the formless so that it does not remain void, that it does not remain uninhabited. But how were the waters that covered the earth brought together if the waters covered the earth? Were basins formed? Were mountains raised? We're going to look at a couple of different pieces of scripture that might give us a little bit of insight. And one of them is from the Old Testament book of Job. And as we read it, it seems that what happened was quite cataclysmic and powerful. So in Job 38, it tells us that, or he's speaking of creation, so, or who shut the sea with doors when it burst out of the womb. So for the rest of the story, we're not going to need to really speculate, but here is told us point blank. It was cataclysmic, that it burst out of the womb, that it happened rather instantaneous, that it was quick. So we're going to look at another verse, and this is in Psalms, and this is Psalms 104, and it is 6 through 9, 104, 6 through 9. And this is just a piece of what's speaking of this account of creation. It says, "You covered it with the deep as with a garment, and waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth." The scripture says, "And then let dry land appear." And that literally means let dry ground be seen. So it had been hidden because it had been covered with the waters. And the Lord caused the ground to rise and sink so that the waters would drain into the lower portions, and the higher portions would be dry ground. The earth became this terra aqueous globe. So both the references in Job and in the language of Psalms 104, it seems to point out that there was some type of tectonic, volcanic, and convulsion which caused great changes on the Earth's surface. The upheaval of some parts and the depression of others to make basins. And that's where the water rushed down. It's a well-accepted fact, and we talked about this previously, that the landmass we see today on this planet is not how it was originally. In the beginning, there was one contiguous land mass, not several, right? Not several continents as we have today. The original configuration of land and water has been called Pangea, or the Pangean Earth. And this is kind of a representation here is what, and it has the various nations that we know today, but it's where they would be on this contiguous mass of land before the continent separated. That was Pangea. You notice there are other places that water could be. It doesn't mean, when the biblical text says that the waters were to be gathered into one place and let the dry land appear, does not mean that there were not bodies of water, like lakes, streams, seas, etc. The wording, what the text is saying, is that the seas were to be in one place and dry land in another place. So there's dry land and there's water, right? There's the seas, there's the oceans, there's the lakes. And that was the dry land just made itself known. It appeared. And that's what the Psalms 104 seems to say, is that he set a boundary that they may not pass. So, therefore the waters have their place and the dry land has its place. I think it's interesting to think that the Creator God is bringing order out of chaos by causing what seems like chaos. That is, the potential of the volcanic and tectonic activity to cause mountains to rise and valleys to sink and fill with water. But that appears to be exactly what happened. But it wasn't chaos, because there was no destruction. It was construction. And there wasn't any death that was involved. So as we look at this Pangea and the original one landmass on the earth after the dry land appeared. It was around 1858 that a man, Antonio Snyder Pellegrini, he proposed that the continents were not always separated as they are today. And he argued on the basis of fossil evidence that they were originally connected to a supercontinent and were pushed apart by the global flood. So the fossil and lithographic evidence for this is quite compelling. For example, there are fossils on the east coast of South America matching those on the west coast of South Africa. So there's even fossil evidence that shows that these continents once were together. Furthermore, the shape of the continents is such that they do fit kind of like a lot of pieces to a puzzle, right? A jigsaw puzzle. And when connected, the rock layers and the fossils match very well. They match nicely. So this plate tectonics is the scientific idea, this theory, and explains how these major landforms were created as a result of Earth's subterranean movements. And that theory was solidified in the 1960s. And it really transformed earth sciences by explaining many phenomena such as mountain building events, volcanoes, and earthquakes. So if you've ever been experienced an earthquake, that's tectonic activity. It's the plates in the earth that are moving, and when they move and they collide, one has to go up and one has to go down, and it causes very much trauma on the earth, and it causes earthquakes, and it causes land masses to rise and others to fall. And of course volcanoes. I was looking just the other day And there were about 13 or 14 active volcanoes yesterday, or day before yesterday. And that means they have lava. Not that they're erupting, maybe, but they're active and they have lava running. So that's the type of activity that we still see today. But we look at well-known, if you live in California, this is a very familiar picture for you, right? This is a tectonic plate activity location. That's the San Andreas Fault. That's the fault line in California. And you can see that it's caused these mountains to rise. So secular geologists, they had to modify this idea to accommodate their belief in vast ages. And so rather than the continent breaking up at the time of the global flood, they proposed that the plates gradually drifted apart over millions of years. So creation geologists and secular geologists, they largely agree on the mechanism of the plate tectonics, the continental separation, mountain building, the volcanoes. The disagreement is on when these events occurred and how quickly they took place. Where the secular scientists will call this the continental drift, the biblical creationists in the geologists will call it the continental sprint, because they think that it took place much quicker than over millions of years. So the evidence is that the separation of the land, these land masses, was more rapid than slow, actually. Otherwise, there's really no explanation of how the fossil records are so consistent, right? If it took millions of years to separate, how are the fossil records, how are they still consistent? It had to have been a rather rapid separation of the land masses, right? And also the land masses themselves, the rock types, are exact in corresponding continents, like where they separate from. And an example is the Pyrenees mountain range in France and the Appalachian mountain range in North America are matching geologically. That is, they're made of the same geologic materials, insinuating that they were once one mountain range that became separated. And that seems to be the evidence. So we'll look more closely at this when we study Genesis and the flood, chapter 6. But it seemed to fit here as well. And it's kind of interesting to just take note and look at this and remember that the earth looked different in ancient times. Here, as we're reading in Genesis, at least up until the flood, which then that flood, it lasted about a full year, over a year before Noah was able to get off the ark. But things were different than how they appear today. There have been many changes, many geological changes. So I had in my mind a question of what type of geologic erosions might have taken place at the initial formation when Creator God caused the mountains to rise and the waters to rush quickly into the depressions. What kind of erosion would there have been? Not only the formation, but just the erosion of the water running off of the land as it was raised up and into the depressions. And I was just wondering, I was talking with Dr. Rick Oliver on this, and there's been speculation on it, but there's no way to really study it. And it's interesting to think about, but I guess it really doesn't matter, because things were changed over time anyway. But at least it was a thought that came into my mind, and I had to try to follow up on it. But what is noteworthy is the reasons that the dry ground was made to appear. Why? Creator God could have intended the globe to remain covered with water, right? Didn't have to make dry ground appear. He could have created merman and mermaid race. Just kept the globe covered with water and just created mermen and mermaids and all the aquatic animals, and that's what he could have had. And I say that, and it sounds ridiculous, but if life began in the primordial waters, Why didn't evolution continue in the primordial waters and just stay there? Why is it that there's not a race of mer people? Wouldn't that make more sense? Right, but there aren't. And there is no evidence that land life forms evolved from the water, from water life forms. There's speculation, a deep belief system, and that holds to the evolutionary cycle, but no true evidence shows that. The biblical text gives as this next aspect of creation after dry land appears. And we're going to look at this. So what happened after the dry land appears? There's got to be a reason, right? There has to be a reason, because everything that's done, there's a purpose behind it. So we're going to look, and here's just a pretty picture of all the good stuff. It says, and God said, let the earth sprout vegetation and plants, yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which there's seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so, and the Lord brought forth vegetation. Right, the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, there was morning, the third day. So where did the plants come from? All the varieties. Right? The ability to reproduce after their own kind. Where did those come from? From the water? Did they crawl out of the water too? Well, evolution has their theory. Well, they call it a hypothesis. Right? And according to an article in Scientific America, there's the C. paradoxus genome. It's a little creature, right? Little kind of plant creature. And what they're saying is this must have happened only once, because most modern plants share the genes that make this merger of the photosynthesizer and a larger host cell possible. And that union required cooperation, not just from the original host, but the formerly this free-ranging photosynthesizer, right? But there also had to be some form of a bacterial parasite. And they're suggesting that it was a chlamydia-like cell, much like the one that causes Legionnaire's disease. And that provided the genes that enable the transfer of food, right? The transfer of the food and the photosynthesis. Not now. Anyway, that's what they're thinking. Now, what they're saying is that there was a hypothesis of a biologist named Lynn Margulis, and that this is strong support for that hypothesis. So what you have is something that once in a lifetime, once in ever, got together with something else once forever and had a bacteria in it that once forever, and that's where the first plant came from. Now, that doesn't explain how did they reproduce? Where did they come from? This is all theory. But we look around and we see all these plants. But at least they're honest in saying that it's stating a hypothesis, not a fact. Now, however, it may be taught in school as a scientific fact, but it's not. It's a hypothesis, a theory, because there is no evidence. They just see things and they try to determine what might have happened. Well, there's another hypothesis. There's another theory. And it runs against the same roadblocks, is you can't prove it. There's not the evidence there to prove it, because it's already happened and it's not continuing to happen. You can't see it, you can't reproduce it. This theory, I think, is the one I agree with. No, I do agree with it. And it's the one that's in the biblical text. And this theory says And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit, trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on earth. And it was so. Earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So, here's the next question. What came first? What came first? The chicken or the egg? Or the seed or the plant? Well, it seems the biblical text states for us exactly what came first. And that's what we're going to read. It was the plant. The biblical text states that the plant sprouted with the ability to reproduce seed after its own kind. So the plant came first. The biblical text specifically mentions trees bearing fruit with the seed, and so we can assume that plants were intended as a food source, which we do find out later in the biblical text, right? But also vegetation supplies something very, very important for the environment. Oxygen and carbon dioxide, both necessary for land life. So land life, fauna, living and breathing creatures, right, could not live on Earth without plants. And that's because A, plants are food, and B, without plants, the oxygen in our atmosphere would be depleted within about 400 years. So we look at this and we say, okay, plants are necessary, and they're environmentally necessary. They're necessary for our atmosphere. They're necessary for each other, and they're necessary for land life, for animal life. They're necessary for human survival. They're necessary for oxygen, because they will deplete, the oxygen will be depleted if they're not doing their photosynthesis, and then they're taking a break, right? They're breathing oxygen and they're breathing out carbon dioxide, but they replenish the oxygen on this earth as well. But so if the plants come first, and then there's a great extension of time, right, before animal life crept out of the water. How did the plants survive? What aerated the soil for the plants? Right now we know there's a lot of activity of smaller animals like worms and bugs and gophers and moles, and they're a pain, but they serve a purpose. They help agitate and aerate the soil that helps the plants grow, and without that the plants could not continue to survive, at least at the rate that they have, right? So what if there weren't worms and such? What facilitated, how about the facilitation of just the plant seeds being spread around for replenishment? Animals right now that play a large part in transporting spores and cells to other places, and the research is showing that there's very, very, very few plants on Earth that could spread their seeds far enough to replenish their own species. So how would the plants be pollinated if it wasn't for insects, bees, so to speak? How would they pollinate? There is wind action, but it doesn't work as well as the insect action. What I'm saying is there's a lot of things that had to happen all at the same time, are relatively very, very close, or the plants would not survive. How about the microbial and the microbacterial action that comes, replenishes like the nitrates, right? Nitrogen in the ground, comes from living animals, feces, and it's broken down, goes back into the ground. You know, we do a lot of artificial fertilization now, not using fertilizers. But what if there wasn't nature to fertilize? There's so many things that are we look at and we think they might be coincidental, but they're all necessary to each other, and it all had to happen at the same time, or one couldn't survive without the other. So I'm just saying that it could not have been a very long time before the arrival of other than plant life on the earth, where the plants themselves could not have survived. And without the plants, living and breathing animals could not survive. I mean, that's just the way it is. Well, our theory, based on the biblical text, is there is a creator God who did what man assumes takes millions of years to do. Right? So the creator God did this thus far in 3 days. That's what the biblical text says. I've said this before. No one has hard evidence of creation that can be reproduced. Empirical evidence is absent for any position. But there is supportive evidence that does exist. It all depends on if you want to believe in a creator God or not. Those that don't have their theories based on, those who have their theories based on not God, they find evidence that supports their theory. Those that have a biblical worldview, right, we see the supportive evidence of the creator God as given in the biblical text. So, it's really up to you, right? It's up to you. You take the information that's there and you make it fit. We all have to develop our own thought process, our own view of this world and how it came into being and where it's going. What I'm presenting to you is what the biblical text says. So it's up to you. Take it or leave it. But the evidence is there. The supportive evidence is there that fits very, very well with what God's word, the biblical text, says about creation. Well, thank you. This has been Orthotomeo. I am Dr. S.W. Kibler, and I'm going to ask you to remember to do something, right? I want you to know the truth, stand on the truth, and speak the truth. God bless you.